Good morning. I'm going to continue my series on the 2014 Sinquefield Cup. Fantastic performance by Fabiano Caruana, who here has the white pieces against Topalov. The format of the tournament is 6 players play each other twice, once with each colour. So he's already played and beaten every other player, Caruana, and now he starts on the second time round the players, and he plays for the second time Topalov. He won the first game with black and now he plays with white. Let's see. E4, C5, Sicilian. Knight comes to F3, E6. This is called the French variation because you can get there by playing E4, E6, standard French, and the knight to F3, the knight's variation, and then sometimes called the Sicilian invitation, and bishop pawn C5. So Caruana puts a pawn in the middle, it's taken, and the knight takes its place. And Topalov develops knight c3. This is now the Sicilian defense Taimanov variation. So, yeah, we're back to Sicilian. And it's called the Taimanov variation. It's popularized by the Russian Grandmaster Mark Taimanov, who, as well as being a Grandmaster at chess, was a very talented concert pianist. And when they played together at tournaments, him and former world champion Vasily Smyslov would often entertain the crowd by Taimanov playing the piano and Smyslov, who was a talented opera singer, singing some opera. So yeah, just an interesting little historical fact for you there. But yeah, it's aiming at making strong the d5 point for black. That's the whole point of the Taimanov. But it does produce weak dark squares and a couple of possible holes around the king. So the knight comes out, standard development. The pawn comes here because once the knight comes here, then you're threatening to come here with the knight, and then, or here with this knight, and then come into this square, which can lead to trouble. So he takes the knight, and Taimanov. Topalov has to settle for some damage to his queenside pawn structure. He can't afford to take the D pawn because then he just takes off the queen, and the king will be stuck in the middle. And after he takes the queen, white will instantly have bishop to G5 check, followed by queenside castles check, and we'll have gained a couple of moves in development at the very least. So he takes with the B pawn, and the bishop comes to D3, again just developing his pieces. The pawn comes to D5. Obviously it is a threat to take the pawn, because if he takes back with the bishop, then the queen gets taken, and no longer such a clear position for white. So Caruana castles so that if the pawn is taken, he can take with the bishop, and then if the queen gets taken, he can take with the rook and still dominate the open d file. So it's not worth it for him. The knight comes to f6 to develop, and also at the same time to threaten the e pawn. The rook defends, and the bishop comes to e7. Pawn comes to e5 to threaten the knight. This is one of the advantages of the Taimanov for white, is that you get the chance to play at e5 and constrict your opponent's pieces severely. And that's what he does, and the knight goes back. Alright, the pawn is now under threat, and this is his hope, is that he can mount a campaign against this pawn and win it. The queen comes to g4, the most aggressive line. You can't defend this pawn simply by castling, because then the bishop will come to h6, threatening the pawn with the queen and bishop, and you can't take it because if you take it, well, you can't take it because it's pinned, and if you move the pawn to get out of the mate threat, then the rook is lost. So you can't just castle, so he plays king to f8. It's a concession. It looks a very bad concession, but theoretically this is the correct way to do it. I think the analysis will say about minus 0.7 to black, I'm guessing. Sorry, plus. I meant plus to white, but it's plus. It's only half a pawn, so theoretically that was a perfectly good move. It's suggesting that g6 is better, but okay. The knight comes out to a5. It seems like a long way out away from the action and not particularly well placed, but black always has to be aware of the knight, the possibilities of the knight coming to b6 and possibly c5. Yeah. So queen comes to a5, not to threaten the knight, which is defended by the queen, but to threaten the rook, which is undefended. Now, a bishop move will defend that rook, but it also allows black then the opportunity to begin to think about threatening the pawn on b2 with rook to b1 for example, b8 for example. So instead he plays rook to e2, where it's no longer threatened by the queen, and also it plays a defensive role. Pawn comes to h5 to chase the queen, and the queen comes to f4, the same line as the king. Another pawn chases the queen, and now he develops the bishop and says, you take my queen, I'll take yours. And black's pawn structure would be particularly weak there. So he doesn't agree to that, and he retreats with his queen. So Caruana plays his queen to g3, keeping up the pressure on the g4 pawn, and the pawn comes to h4 to threaten the queen once more. And the queen comes to g4, and now he's got a double threat on this pawn on g4. Yeah. So the king, the rook defends the pawn by going to g8. Now it's two defenders, the bishop and the rook, against two attackers, the bishop and the queen. And obviously that wouldn't be a good trade for white, so he can't do that. He doubles up his rooks on the important file, even although it's not open or half open yet. It is a good place to have the rook on this e file. Pawn comes to c5, so he's threatening to play c4 and squeeze that bishop. Bishop could come here, but then the rook comes here and the bishop's not got anywhere to go anymore. So he proposes a trade. They trade, and e6 becomes a focal point for both the queen and the bishop. And if you could think about maybe getting a rook to f3, then it might be actual to take this pawn and begin a queenside attack. Topalov plays b7 to prevent this rook from coming to c3. Caruana makes some space for his king, and the rook comes to the open central file. The bishop leaves the file and also comes to the long diagonal. Really well placed bishop. The knight is looking to rearrange itself, and the rook comes to e3, hopping one day to get to the square c3, so that this pawn could then be taken. Topalov, I think this is a terrible mistake. to play the rook to c6 and abandon the defence of the defence of the c3 square, because this allows a brilliant sacrifice by Caruana. Gives up the bishop for 2 pawns. Says check first, then takes, and now when he takes with the queen, he's threatening queen takes rook check. And it's difficult to find a good square for the rook, especially with the bishop on the long diagonal. Even though it's not open yet, it can be opened quickly. But he threatens the rook again and threatens at the same time to come to h8 with check. Knight comes to d4 for a double threat on the rook on f3. Pawn comes to e6, cutting out these escape squares to the king so that queen to h8 check would force the bishop to come back here, where the rook could take it. But the rook is taken, that threat no longer applies. And the bishop comes to f8 to defend the bishop on the rook on g7, thinking that he's just making things even again. But instead of taking the rook first, he plays the bishop, the queen to h5 check. And now when the king comes to e7, now he takes the rook. And if Topalov takes back, the queen comes here, and then the king must come here, and then the rook comes here, and the king is chased away from the defence of the queen. So Caruana gets a queen for a rook and piece, and he still has his passed pawn on the 6th. It's suddenly a crushing position. So I just, people have to make mistakes in order for people to win games of chess. Knight to c6 was a terrible mistake, but he brilliantly pounced on it, Caruana, and he had already created the conditions for that attack before Topalov made the mistake. So how much do we say it's Topalov's mistake, and how much do we say it's Caruana's brilliant preparation for that possible mistake? Because the knight was doing nothing where it was. It had to go back to b8, and then the only place it could come out was c3, and he made himself ready for that plan of Topalov's. And that's 6 wins in a row for Caruana. Again, I can't stress how much of a brilliant performance this was by Fabiano Caruana. Veselin Topalov, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Levon Aronian, Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, in the world's top 10 then, still amongst the top players in the world, and he brushed them aside. Brilliant, brilliant performance. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.